Hi, boys and girls. Mrs. Peterman here. Mr. Wonka must go on. Hurry along down the corridor. Today, I am coming to you from outside, so you might hear some music in the background. You might hear some dogs barking, but I couldn't miss being outside on this beautiful day. Our next chapter is called Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed down the corridor. The nut room, it said on the next door that they came to. All right, said Mr. Wonka. Stop here for a moment and catch your breath and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the nut room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels. Everyone looked around the door. Oh, look, Grandpa, look, cried Charlie. Squirrels, shouted Veruca Salt. Jeepers, said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at the tremendous speed. These squirrels are specifically trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts, Mr. Wonka explained. Why use squirrels? Mike TV asked. Why not use Oompa Loompas? Because, said Mr. Wonka, Oompa Loompas can't get nuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them into two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult, but in my factory, I insist upon using only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels do the job. Aren't they wonderful the way they go and get those nuts out? And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one? If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There, look, watch the squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one now. They watched the little squirrel, and as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles, he cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. Hey, Mommy, shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. I decided I want a squirrel. Give me one of those squirrels. Don't be silly, sweetheart, said Mrs. Salt. These all belong to Mr. Wonka. I don't care about that, shouted Veruca. I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel. All right, my pet, Mrs. Salt said smoothly. Mummy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as we possibly can. But I don't want any old squirrel, Veruca shouted. I want a trained squirrel. At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. Very well, Wonka, he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. How much do you want for one of these crazy squirrels? Name your price. They're not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going in to grab me a squirrel this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small, black, beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. All right, Veruca said, I'll have you. She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, in the first split of a second, her hands started to go forward. There was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 got hold of her right leg and anchored it to the floor. 24 caught hold of her left leg. and the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up on her shoulder and started tapping. Tap, tap, tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. "Save her!" screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went to tap, tap, tapping the side of her head with his knuckles. Then all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. "Her head must have sounded quite hollow." Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly and she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Wonka. "Down the garbage chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Then save her!" cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed she had. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What happens to bad nuts? Where does the chute go?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory. All the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that. Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know?" "I do, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the big garbage pipe go in the end?" "Why, to the furnace," Mr. Wonka said calmly. "To the incinerator." Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today." "A chance!" yelled Mrs. Salt. "My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now see here, Wonka," he added. "I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump, I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am." "Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka. "I expect she'll turn up sooner or later. She may not have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole. And if that's the case, you'll all have to go in and pull her out again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. "Veruca!" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Are you down there?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole, with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. "Good gracious me," said Mr. Salt as he watched his wife go tumbling down the hole. "What a lot of garbage there's going to be today." He saw her disappearing into the darkness. "What's it like down there, Aunt Gina?" he called out. He leaned further. The squirrels rushed right up behind him. "Help!" he shouted, but he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. "Oh dear!" cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. "What on earth is going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. But what about the great fiery incinerator?" asked Charlie. "They only light it every other day," said Mr. Wonka. "Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen, here comes another song." From far away down the corridor came the beating of the drums, and the Oompa Loompas began to sing. Okay, boys and girls, so one less character in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Miss Veruca Salt is now gone, so that leaves Charlie and Mike TV. Okay, so continue to be reading every day and working hard on your assignments. I am so very, very, very proud of you, and I will come back tomorrow with another chapter of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And later on this week, I will have a guest reader reading one of our very favorite books in our house. So you'll have to wait for our guest reader until later on this week. Talk to you later, boys and girls. Bye-bye.